Okay, let me now play some clips from this fantastic video I came across recently talking about the railway connecting China to Tehran, going through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. So it's 10,400 kilometers, and it's a China-Iran railway that doesn't go through any Western allied countries. And you'll see the significance of this. Let me just play some clips here.
On May 25th, 2025, China sent 32 containers of cargo to Iran, 10,400 kilometers away, not on a ship, not through any ocean, on a freight train that rolled through scorching deserts, cut across mountain ranges, passed through 4 separate countries, and arrived in just 15 days. The same journey by sea takes up to 40 days. That is not just an engineering achievement, that is a statement. For years, America's most powerful weapon against countries like Iran had nothing to do with missiles or soldiers. It was economic strangulation. Block a country's oil sales, freeze its bank accounts, cut it off from global markets, and watch it slowly run out of options. That strategy works because America controls the ocean. And if you need to move something in large quantities, you almost always have to use those waters. For Iran, every attempt to break free from that grip got pushed back, until a freight train quietly proved that you do not need the ocean at all. China built a route that runs entirely over land, through territory no Western Navy can patrol, arriving in Iran without a single dollar changing hands. The economic fence that took decades to build just had a massive hole punched through it, and that hole is only getting bigger. By the end of this video, you will understand how this railway was built, what it means for Iran's economy, and what China is really planning beyond this single route. There is a 5-nation expansion plan already moving forward, a frozen Arctic route being developed in parallel, and a long-term strategy designed to shift global trade away from Western control. The railway is just the opening move. China needed a route that no navy could threaten, no sanctions could reach, and no blockade could close. The answer was to leave the ocean behind entirely and build across land instead. And the only country whose geography made that possible was Iran. The railway nobody could block. Building a railway from China to Iran sounds straightforward on paper. In reality, it means crossing some of the most punishing terrain on Earth. Massive open deserts where sand shifts constantly beneath the surface. Mountain ranges sitting in earthquake-prone zones where the ground itself cannot always be trusted. Temperatures that crack concrete and warp metal. And the route passes through 4 different countries, each with its own borders, customs, rules, and railway gauges that were never originally designed to connect with each other. None of that stopped the builders. The railway begins in western China and heads westward across Kazakhstan, then through Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, before finally crossing into Iran and arriving at the apron dry port near Tehran. 10,400 kilometers of connected track through terrain that most engineering teams would walk away from. To give that distance some context, it is roughly the same as flying from London to Los Angeles and still having hundreds of kilometers left to cover. The project cost upward of $2 billion. Funding came from Chinese policy banks, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and a mix of bilateral loan agreements. Solving the gauge mismatch between countries was itself a major engineering undertaking. Russia and Central Asia use a broader gauge than China, which means cargo either needs to be physically transferred to different carriages at borders, or specialized bogie exchange systems have to be installed so the same container can roll across different track widths. Automated bogie exchange stations were built at key border crossings specifically for this corridor, cutting the time lost at transitions from hours to under 30 minutes. Because the terrain was so dangerous in certain sections, key stretches of the railway in Iran were built underground, not just to handle extreme weather, but to protect the line from potential airstrikes.
Okay, so did you note when they first completed? And by the way, it's kind of like with the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States that met at Promontory Point, Utah. You might remember that, learned that. It wasn't like there were already existing rail networks that then they just connected to other ones. You know what I mean? Like they didn't literally start from scratch with there's no railroads and start from one point in Boston or something and then go to San Francisco. That's not what it meant. So it's likewise here. There were already other things that they kind of linked up with. But the point being, was that durable, high-grade railway connecting China to Tehran, when was that finished? Did you catch it? May 25th, 2025. Huh. That's kind of a coincidence. And of course, the point being that, the railroad by itself, that can't replace shipping over water. Just see the size of those cargo ships. So, those super tankers, I think they have like 2 million barrels of crude on them. But you can see how that trend really negates the U.S. advantage of controlling the seas. And in a situation like right now, and by the way, what made me go look up the particulars of that railway, I had heard about the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm sure lots of you have heard that, but it wasn't fully on my radar until I heard recently some military analysts, like on Judge Napolitano's show, or I think Glenn Deason, I think the guy's name is, explain just matter of fact, like, oh yeah, now the U.S. is bombing the railroad, but you can fix a railroad pretty fast that connects to, because the Iranians can be exporting their oil to China. So in terms of the big picture, if the point is, oh yeah, we're going to blockade, they're going to close the strait, well, we're going to put a blockade. So Iran, now your oil is going to be overflowing because you can't get it out. And we're really sticking it to China, right? Like people arguing that this is, and overlooking that, well, yeah, but that railroad lets China still get access to a lot of that oil. Okay. So you can see the strategic significance of that and why, maybe that had something to do with the 12-day war that started, a couple weeks after that railroad was finished. Okay, let me now show you, since the Strait of Hormuz has been closed, here is the source of U.S. crude imports. All right, let me take a moment. With President Trump saying at various points recently, yeah, we don't need the Strait of Hormuz. We're self-sufficient. The U.S. produces more crude oil than we need. In fact, you Europeans, you can go clear the strait if you want it, or better yet, why don't you just buy the oil from us, right? And other people may have said that the U.S. is now a net oil exporter. All right, I've said that, and this conflict made me get more precise. When we say that the U.S. now is a net oil exporter, it means if you include petroleum products in the, when you say oil. If you're just talking about crude oil per se, no, the U.S. is not a net oil exporter. We still import more than we export. And even what's more important for the current discussion, what happened was that I guess in the 2010s, there was an explosion in U.S., a good explosion, meaning a movement upward, not literally things blowing up, a sharp increase in U.S. crude output because of the so-called fracking revolution, right? So hydraulic fracturing, also it was sideways drilling. It wasn't just the fracking that allowed for a huge increase in production from like the Permian Basin, all right? And so that's when there was I think it was in 2015, there had been an export ban that was lifted, right? So for a long time, it was literally illegal for the U.S. to export oil because, hey, no, we got to keep it all at home. And they lifted that because we were just cranking out all this oil. But the nuance is the shale boom was light sweet oil, crude oil, whereas U.S. refineries were configured to process medium to heavy sour crude from like Mexico and South America and Saudi Arabia. Okay, so that's partly why they said, well, let's just export, this new boom in, the shale has produced, drill, baby, drill. Okay. And so that's why the U.S. is still importing more. And then also, now let's flash up this table here. You can see so that the 227, the top there is showing the week ending, and then it gives the date, right? So these columns are weekly averages. And so the week ending of February 2027, remember this recent war with Iran started, or hostilities that are not a war that's already been won. This war that was never a war that's already been won, as I'm recording this several times, has been won. So the week ending 227 is right before the thing started. Okay, and you can see Saudi Arabia was sending and these are thousands of barrels per day average for the week. So Saudi Arabia was sending 520,000 barrels a day. And you can see it increased over time. And we're going to come back to that point in a minute. But you can see Venezuela was 143, and then it zoomed up. Like it peaked at 549,000. And then the last data point I've gotten here is the week ending April 17th. It was 499,000. Okay, so tripling. More than tripling. Okay. And so let me now make 2 points related to that. So first, the Saudi Arabia point. How is it that we're still getting oil from Saudi Arabia? In fact, we increased what we've been taking in from them once this conflict started. Well, because here we're flashing up this map here. They have the Strait of Hormuz is closed there on the right, but Saudi Arabia has an east-west pipeline that ends up in Yanbu on the Red Sea. All right, and so that's how they've been getting their oil out. And Iran hit that, and the Saudis repaired it really right. So the Saudis were ready. So as far as my overarching thesis that some of the players on the global stage had reasons for doing what they did besides just stupidity or wickedness. You may remember there was a long conflict with Saudi Arabia with Yemen. And I think probably what was, one big component of that was that they knew, eventually the U.S. is going to war with Iran and they're going to close the strait, and we got to make sure we can keep shipping out of the Red Sea. And so we got to keep these Houthis under control. All right, because the Houthis would be able to stop that export choke point if they were running roughshod. Okay, so again, that doesn't mean the libertarians, guys like Scott Horton, Dave Smith in particular, that was for a while, that was like Dave's thing that he was bringing up when he was getting spots on popular TV shows several years ago. And he would bring up the horrible war against Yemen that the U.S. was complicit in, that the Saudis were waging. And obviously from a libertarian, let alone just a Christian point of view, I'm not saying Dave's Christian, his points were all valid, but I'm saying it was more like you could just understand, why are they doing that? They just starving people and blowing people? No, they were doing it presumably because they looked ahead and saw this coming. And then the last point I'll make here is likewise with, again, just to remind you, the shipments from Venezuela. Oh, and you can even see, I included in this table a year ago. So the week ending March 7th of 2025, just to give a frame of reference, it was 148,000 barrels a day that we got. And then again, you can see how it's much higher once this crisis hit. And so I think it makes sense for, the Maduro operation. And so here, let me again just so you understand like who what I'm trying to explain and say let's think more about this, folks. Here, let me just, not to pick on David Stockman, but he, right when that operation occurred, he was saying things like this.
You watch the news right now, and everybody is saying, well, look, they got the biggest oil reserves in the world, 300 billion barrels, even more than Saudi Arabia, and that the Chinese are monkeying around down there, and we can't let the Chinese in get some of that oil. And there's 4 or 5 Russians there, maybe 10. We can't let them get involved either, which is totally ridiculous because Russia has all the oil it needs and can't even find a market for what it wants to sell because of the sanctions. But in any case, what I'm going after here is the so-called 303 billion barrels of reserves in Venezuela ain't what it's cracked up to be, because it's, all crude oil is not created equal, even, notionally. So one should look at the cost curve. And what you have here is the highest cost, low gravity, high sulfur crude oil deposits on the planet that cost upwards of $95 a barrel to get it out of the ground, transport it to the refineries, refine it, and put it into product form. On the other hand, when you do that, this is even more significant. When you do that, you end up with a slate of products that is very inferior. In other words, out of a refinery, you get really valuable things like gasoline or jet fuel, and then you get a lot of really low value products like heavy residual oil, and almost tar and coke and so forth. Now, the point I'm making here is the oil in Venezuela, maybe 303 billion barrels as they count abstractly reserves, but it generates a much less valuable slate. So if the world price, let's say, has been, for the most part, $70 a barrel on WTI, West Texas Intermediate, which is the sort of marker grade of crude. If it's been $70 a barrel, you only get about $45 a barrel for this heavy, low gravity gunk oil that comes out of the Orinoco Belt in Venezuela, the so-called ultra heavy crude. Now, here's a little dilemma for Venezuela, which shows this isn't just a socialist problem that their industry is ailing and falling apart and declining. It's a market problem as well. To make it real simple, they get $45 a barrel for the inferior slate that comes out of a barrel of crude from the Orinoco, and the cost to bring it to market is 95. Okay, so effectively, the economic loss per barrel at the standard of where the world market is. People know crude oil has been as high as 150, and some moments during the pandemic it dropped way down into the 30s or less. But $70, if you look at the charts over time, is a pretty good steady state. So when the world is at steady state on the marker crude of $70 a barrel, Venezuela heavy is generating $45 of revenue and $95 of cost, $50 a barrel of loss.
Okay, so again, Stockman is correct from a libertarian perspective. If you had George Washington were the president, then yes, and we had just peaceful commerce with everybody and strategic entangling alliances with nobody, what he's saying would make perfect sense. And oil is fungible, and it doesn't really make sense to say like, oh no, we're going to try to keep this oil away from China and whatever. But given what's happened since then, you can see why those objections don't really hold up. right? That, to say, oh, well, but the global price would need to be such and such. And the war players like, well, yeah, we know we're going to hit Iran in a month. So don't worry. Global prices will jump to make this quote make sense and be economic. And you can see that they're doing it. And again, also just to make sure you're getting the refinery point, U.S. motorists rely on medium to heavy sour crude, such as is produced by Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Canada, whereas the huge boom in U.S. output from shale fields is light sweet that they can't use. In the long run, they can retool, but I'm just saying right now, if you got to wage a big war against Iran now, and they're going to close the Strait of Hormuz, and what's going to happen, you can see it makes more sense. Oh, that's probably why they did the Maduro thing first, get that locked down, and now proceed to the bigger target. And again, not because some inexplicable reason this tiny little country in the Middle East seems to control our government, but also that this will help in the strategic jostling to try to contain China, which if we don't do something quick, they're going to get so far ahead of us we can't touch them, right? So I'll stop there. I hope I've made my case. Again, just one last attempt to avoid misunderstanding. Not saying the U.S. government's moves